Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're all enjoying day two of our conference. It is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. JS Park is an interfaith hospital chaplain whose role includes grief counseling, attending every death, every trauma, and Code Blue, staff care, and supporting end-of-life care. JS has seen how myths about grief have harmed his patients and their families. He is also, through education and experience, and found ways to unravel these myths to provide deeper support for patients in both crisis and chronic conditions, and to move towards healthier grief and communal mourning. Please welcome JS Park to talk about confronting grief, myths, and what matters.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It is wonderful to be here with you. Um, I am a hospital chaplain, as Katrina mentioned. I have been a hospital chaplain now for 9 years. And very often I meet people in the very worst moments of their lives. I work in the trauma bay. I work every death. I attend every code blue. And we also assist with end of life care and end of life planning. And I'm also the one who often makes the phone calls to family to let them know their loved one is there. So very often that's also the worst moment of their lives as well. And for 9 years now, I've been on the front lines, front and center with grief. And every time I think I've seen uh, one more expression of grief, I see another one. And so today we'll talk about confronting myths around grief. Uh, what are myths around grief? And then we'll dismantle those and we'll talk about what we can do to grieve in a way that is healthy and healing and liberating. I'm also going to be talking maybe a little bit back and forth, both to those who work in healthcare, those who are grieving their own losses, and for those who have friends and family who are grieving their losses as well. So once in a while, I'll switch the perspective, but hopefully it'll be something that each of us can take away from. And I'll be doing this in three different parts. I'll be talking about you plus grief, then grief plus others, and then what we can do together. So myths around grief. This is going to be about you and grief. What are some myths about grief? One of the things I've learned is that we have false narratives and beliefs about what it means to grieve. And the biggest one that I've actually seen is that grief is about letting go, that successfully grieving means I no longer feel sad. It's about turning the page, letting go, moving on, and then starting a new chapter. When grief, I have found across 9 years and through my own losses, is not moving on, but moving with. It's not necessarily about letting go, but letting in. How do we keep the memory up? How do we carry this loss with us? How do we navigate and move forward with this loss, this irretrievable and irreturnable loss in our lives? How do we walk in that wake? So, one myth about grief in that context, a myth about grief. Um, One myth I've learned is only death is loss. But there are a lot of other different kinds of losses. Non-death loss is still loss. Non-death loss is still loss. So, for example, moving to a new place, a next stage in life, a divorce, breakup, the breakdown of old valued items, losing physical ability and baseline health, coworker leaving, losing a job, starting a job, a changed faith or changing community. These losses are sometimes called symbolic loss or symbolic losses. But really, I don't think there's anything symbolic about them. They are deeply and uniquely painful, just as meaningful as the death of a loved one. Um, Real quick, some stats. A breakup, in fact, can lead to similar symptoms of bereavement, intrusive thoughts, insomnia, reduced immune system, even heart failure. Losing a job can, in some people, create severe emotional distress and a condition called JLCG, that's job loss related complicated grief. And just as with losing a loved one, losing a dream, a hope that we had about the future, or losing our faith, it requires us to relearn the world, to readjust ourselves without our familiar fail safes. A lot of times we can't move on from loss because these non death losses keep happening. To live is to lose. And so rather than saying, how can I keep moving past this? How can we move with it? Many of my patients, and many of yours, those who work in healthcare, or those of you who have been or are patients, have who are enduring cancer, car accidents, who are enduring illness and injury. They often also talk about their breakup or job loss or lost dreams with equal amounts of sorrow and anguish. Just as hard as the cancer for them is this job that they lost, or they moved to a city and faced some difficulties. These non-death losses, they bring about intense grief. And sadly, they're not often honored as a real loss. So why does that happen? My speculation is that we each have a barometer of something called comparative suffering, in which we are sure that someone else has it worse than us. So if death is considered the hardest of suffering, which I believe it can be, then it seems our own smaller losses don't compare. So I want us to kind of put a pin in that about comparative suffering. For those of you who are listening, watching now, you can jot this down or make a mental note. Have you ever felt that guilt about comparing your what may be a small loss to a bigger loss, a non-death loss to a death? I think we've all felt that level of thinking this loss doesn't count because it's not as big as someone else's. And that's a myth that non-death loss is not loss. And I hope to validate that for you, that those who have experienced a loss that isn't death is in some small way, physically and emotionally, still a death. Another myth, grief is supposed to look somber, solemn. It needs to be controlled. Um, what I found in the hospital is that grief can look very extreme and almost runs between two amplitudes. One can be extreme expressions of emotion, or it can be complete deflation of the body. One can be screaming, shouting, shaking fists, rolling on the floor. I've also seen singing and dancing, rocking back and forth, clapping, yelling prayers. I've also seen not crying at all, numbness, fatigue, cognitive fog, scrolling on the phone to escape, hard to think or focus. Now, in each of these cases, is quote unquote something wrong with you? And the myth is that if you do too much or not enough, then somehow you're not grieving properly. But what I found is that everyone, because we're different, we come from different cultures, backgrounds, upbringings, and we've learned different ways to grieve. Very often, what emerges in the moment of loss, which is we could call emergent grief, is going to burst forth in the way that it needs to, whether that's extreme expression or it's going to be shut down. That's the emergent initial grief that we experience. And so I ask as a chaplain, and I've had these conversations with healthcare workers, with therapists, with those who are mental health professionals. How do we continue to expand our ideas of what is quote unquote acceptable grief? I recently wrote, to be a chaplain in a room, to hold space for grief is a constant ongoing demolition of my definitions. I have to continually make more and more room in my heart and more room in the room for different expressions of grief and to be non-judgmental about it. So when I see someone scrolling on their phone or they're not crying, or I've been to funerals where there are those who just seem to be completely still, there may be judgment from people who say, are they really grieving? But that may be in that moment what their body needs. And so to make space for that, to make conversation in a way that's not judgmental. And here's the third myth. Um, this is a myth. We grieve what we lose. Now, this is not a myth. Of course, we grieve what we lose, but that's incomplete. Grief can also come with growth. Grief can also come with growth. Any time that we grow or we celebrate or we get something new, we can also grieve. With growth often comes grief because any change involves loss, even positive change. Those of us who have experienced PPD, had a spouse who had postpartum depression, who have cared for someone with postpartum depression, Sometimes there are, of course, certainly there's a physiological component to that. My wife, our first child in 2020, she had postpartum depression for about 5 or 6 months. And that was a very, very difficult, grueling time, especially in 2020 when we couldn't lean on our supports like we wanted to. Um, but so often the PPD can come from celebrating the birth of a child and the pressure that that creates, the amount and enormity of the responsibility. It's a beautiful thing to have a baby, and at the same time, what a difficult proposition that can be for many of us. And one of the things that I've seen some new mothers experience, and this includes my wife as well, is on Instagram, I noticed that there's a lot about bounce back culture, which is women who have just given birth. Within 2 weeks, they're like running marathons and they're fitting their old clothes and things like that. To see that even someone else's success, that kind of comparison happens, and we can experience grief. We can grieve what our body used to look like, what it used to do. We can grieve more of the quote unquote freedom that we had before children. When we grow, whether in career, reputation, or emotional maturity found in therapy, we can also find ourselves angry at the presumed lack of growth in others. And that's a natural response. Now, I have a whole lot written here, and I could probably do a whole separate like seminar, webinar on this. But this growth grief, which is what I've learned to call it, this is a grief that is also associated with guilt. Because when we get something new, when we achieve something, when we see someone else celebrating success, there's a guilt that we feel grief about that. There's a guilt, shouldn't I be thankful? Shouldn't I feel grateful that I have this new thing? But it can become very difficult to be thankful when suddenly what is put upon us is this new responsibility or new position or new role that we now have to manage. And many different reasons for that. We can grieve the gap between what we see others doing and what we're doing. We expect others to maybe be further along in their lives and be along with us. And it can be awkward to celebrate ourselves when we see that gap. So, for those of you who have maybe gone up to a management role, I saw this in my wife when she went from nurse to nurse practitioner. She took on a very different role, and that changed her relationships with those who, quote unquote, only worked on the floor. So our grief in that growth can come with loneliness as well as guilt. And one of the most uncomfortable griefs that I've seen in my patient visits is between adult children and their parents. Some of you who work with children or in the NICU, you may have seen where here are adult children who have just given birth, and then you see the grandparents come by, and then you start to see this multi-generational, you see a bit of the awkwardness of how grandparents may try to lead the adult children, and then here's the infant just born into the world. And adult children who feel like they've outgrown their parents in some area of their lives, you can see resentment or even shame, or sometimes complete anger and outrage. Because as adult children grow, as we grow, the image of our parents shifts to a hard reality. I've seen new parents often say, how could my parents have treated me like this? I'm seeing my baby now. I could never have done to my child what happened to what my parents did to me, what happened to me as a child. And then there comes the realization my parents are just people and they were not always the people I needed them to be. So I could say more on this, but I think most of us know this feeling of when we grow, when we experience success, there's a lot of grief that comes with that. And how do we grieve that? Real quick for growth grief, um, we do need extra compassion for ourselves and for others to validate, to acknowledge those feelings of, I feel guilty, I feel lonely. It requires compassion in both directions to not only continue growing and to be content and satisfied that I have growth, I can celebrate that, but to recognize also others have their own pace and tempo, and I can't judge that. And as you grow in your own life, some people may not go with you. They may have difficulty adjusting to this newer you. But when we grow, this requires a very healthy grief to unfurl from expectations in both directions of ourselves and others. So the best thing that I found that we can do in our growth grief is for all of us each day, start over in each moment and take each moment at a time and celebrate each moment and to not judge one another, but have extra compassion for ourselves and others. Which brings us to grief plus others. So, talk about different kinds of grief, grief that we move with and that we're going to live with, and how to stretch and expand through some of the awkward discomfort of that and carry as we carry and move along with our grief and with our losses. But what can we do as we each experience loss and see others experiencing loss? I want to talk real quick about why do we say certain platitudes and cliches to each other. If you have recently experienced loss, or you may remember this from when you may have had people in your life tell you unhelpful things. For example, be strong, don't cry, or don't ask for a lighter load, get a stronger back, or this is God's will for your life. God's going to refine you in the fire. Everything happens for a reason. These kind of statements that while some of them may be helpful or true, they rush you towards a closure and a conclusion that you are not ready for in that moment and maybe never will be ready for. We offer these unintentional cold comforts. Um, so I want to talk about this real quick because why does this happen? When we believe myths about grief, myths being we need to let go, we need to turn the page, or this death is not really a death, or I should feel guilty for growing. When we believe certain myths about grief, a lot of it is about rushing past the grief. And so when we say statements like this to each other, it's very often about pushing someone towards being in a place where they're no longer feeling the hurt of grief. Because when I see someone hurting, I don't want them to be hurting. And so I feel that I need to say something in order for them to feel better. I try to fill the hard silence with something that I think may help. And maybe it's a short-term fix. Maybe that one-liner can sound helpful in that moment. But in the long term, what it's doing is it's dismissing and denying and ignoring what that person is going through. It is offering a bow tie for a situation that is busted wide open. Um, so I've learned these days, it used to enrage me when I was in rooms and I would visit patients and family members or even healthcare workers would say those kind of cliches like, just be positive or it'll be okay, it'll be all right, or everything always works out. When someone said that, I would feel deep anger because I thought you're not helping. If anything, that's just glossing over what they're going through, and they probably won't go to you for help because you just made everything light and breezy when it isn't. But I've also now tried to have a lot more empathy for when people say that because it does hurt to say someone hurt. And we think that we're helping when we say those statements. And sometimes when there's stillness and silence, what we've been, what we've learned is very often, I need to fill this silence. I need to resolve it somehow. I can't let it sit. Because a lot of those myths that we believe about letting go, moving on, let's get straight to the conclusion and the closure. And so I'm trying to have empathy for the person who says those things and to recognize that person is saying those things because that's what they've inherited. That's what they believe is helpful. It's out of positive intent, but it's having potentially harmful consequences. So, one thing that we can help each other with that, whether you're working in healthcare, you're experiencing a loss, if you hear a statement like that, I used to get mad about it, but what I've learned is I've learned to put in place boundaries and then, though it shouldn't be on us to do this, to redirect. So what I mean by that is, let's say you hear someone telling someone else, well, everything happens for a reason, and this is God's will for your life. This is going to have a purpose. And that sounds trite and not helpful. And you can see in the other person's face, it's just gone right over them. Their eyes glaze over. What you may be able to say in that moment is, I know that you're trying to be helpful, and I'm really thankful that you care. But right now, that isn't the best thing to say. It isn't helpful, and I feel like I'm being rushed to something I'm not ready for. So you set the boundary and you redirect. And I've been learning to say that when I'm managing family dynamics, when I'm with a patient, and there's a family member who starts saying stuff to the patient to kind of talk over their grief. I will first try to acknowledge that patient's sadness. I may say something to the patient, like my patient, like, I hear you, and seeing this, I feel sad. I just name the word, or I feel scared, or I feel anxious, or I'll reiterate the word that they're saying. I'm validating what they're saying. And then I'll also turn to that person and I'll say, well, that does sound really nice. I wish everything had a purpose. Right now, it feels like it doesn't. And so putting those boundaries in place and then redirecting, that takes a lot of gentleness, a lot of thoughtfulness. But in doing so, sometimes if it is advocating for the patient, it is advocating for the person who is lost so that they're not being talked over, that their grief is not being suppressed. And again, it takes compassion and empathy for the person saying those cliches to recognize, hey, they're saying this because they think it's helpful, but it isn't. So how do we redirect that? Um, for us who have been prone to say those cliches, here's what I can suggest is that when you see your loved one grieve, your instinct and impulse may be to jump in and say a statement like that, or to just like fill the silence with a lot of theology or advice or lectures, or you have to, or you should. Um, but I would ask each of us, can we self-monitor the impulse to fix? Can we self-monitor? I learned in therapy, and I've been going to consistent therapy for 4 years now. I learned in therapy that I tend to bow tie things very quickly. I jump to inspirational and positive very fast. And the reason that I do that is because I grew up in a very turbulent and violent, abusive home. And I would go to sleep at night scared and angry and hurt and ashamed. And I never had a bow tie at home. In other words, things didn't resolve. Everything was always tense and unresolved. And so as I grew up, if I saw conflict, I'd immediately try to make peace because I didn't want things to stay unresolved, just like the way it was in my home when things were turbulent and violent. So I was very prone to try to wrap things up and make sure that everything was neatly bow tied, sitcom ending. It has to be done in 30 minutes. We can't go to sleep angry. We have to work this out. I couldn't just let things sit. And when I saw someone grieving, my impulse was to try to say things that I thought would cheer them up. And very often that falls flat and is tone deaf. And so I had to figure out therapeutically, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, why did I do that? Where did that impulse to fix come from? And when I could work that out in therapy, I got to the base reason here. And then in the moment, I was able to work on my reflex. When I felt it emerging, I was able to monitor myself and say, I'm going to put a pause on that. And it just took a couple seconds just to be mindful. So we can work on the reasons for why we may say those things, and it can be different for all of us. And then to monitor that impulse to want to try to fix. Again, positive intent, empathy for all, but also recognizing that intent and impact can be worlds apart. So, what can we do? And that segues right into what can we do when we see someone grieving or for our own grief? What can we do? Um, when we experience personal grief, see others grieving, see those even across the world who are grieving, what are some things we can do? This is a three-part kind of almost process. I have it in my book. I've written about it quite a bit on my platforms, on social media. I give it to you today. This is by no means like a, one size fits all or anything that you need to do. But even if there's just one sentence here that may help you through grief or someone else through grief, I hope that this gives you permission or something in your tool set to do that. Um, the first thing is to name. That sounds obvious, but so many times we don't have a name for the things that we experience. And so sometimes we become adrift without reference. We become unmoored within a very large void where things don't make sense. And with that, we are meaning making people. People are naturally inclined to want to make meaning and narrative sense of what's happening. So naming what am I feeling, and then naming where it is in my body, naming the actual loss. This is scary and, of course, difficult for people who are grieving because it is asking us to look into the void and the abyss of that which cannot be returned. That's very difficult for many of us. This is why denial, suppression, rushing past it seems easier because it hurts to hurt. So, can we name it in a way that's safe? We can start in small steps. What are you feeling today, and where in your body? My first supervisor, my chaplaincy training, and the very first year, this was in 2015, Waleska, God bless her, amazing, amazing chaplain, human supervisor. She was fantastic. She would always ask me that question every time we met. How are you feeling today? And where do you feel it in your body? And that would help me to ground myself a little bit, to name what was going on with me. And then we would name deeper things. Like what is it that you are grieving today? Or what is it that you miss? I had a therapist who would ask me this question. She would say, when I was kind of repeating a behavior over and over, she would say, well, what reward do you get out of that? Just to name the reward of that behavior. And then I would say, oh, yeah, I guess that reward isn't worth the consequences of the behavior that I kept repeating. So sometimes naming things illuminates for us where we are, being able to ground ourselves and being able to be very aware of what I can do next. What goals can I make from here? So we name and we ask each other, what are we feeling today? What are we feeling in our body? Simple questions. Second thing is to validate. This goes back earlier to when we bypass or diminish or minimize. Instead of doing that without trying to fix or resolve or spiritualize, instead of trying to positivize it, um, how do we give permission for all the different feelings that we have? So earlier I mentioned about seeing my patients and their families and those extreme expressions of grief. How do we validate that in a non-judgmental way? Um, I had a patient who, after she gave birth, it was an FDIU, fetal demise in utero, and when she delivered, um, she had her baby in her room, uh, her prematurely born child, in her room for days. And there was a lot of conversation in the care with the care team about is this okay? That she has her child who she lost, her child who she's still holding. And she ended up holding her child for 10 days before she was able to finally let go. Um, but the care team and chaplains, the physician, the nurses, our opinions were mostly the same. We validate this loss and we also validate what she needs right now in this moment, to not judge that, to allow the baby to be with her in the room for as long as she needed. And that was a tough conversation. There are some ethics around that. Is that appropriate? Is that okay? Um, but she got to hold her for 10 days. That mother really, really needed that. And so we validated that. I know that there may be different opinions about if that's okay or not, but we're going to run across those situations where how can we make more room in the room for this grief? And that leads into the third thing. So I said name and then validate and then ritualize. I wish I could come up with a better word than ritualize, maybe commemorate or memorialize. But ritualizing is when our grief emerges. Earlier, I mentioned emergent grief. Emergent grief is going to burst out of us almost unintentionally and unconsciously, almost in a way that we can't entirely control, whether that's weeping very loudly or screaming or shaking. That's emergent grief. But then we have intentional and conscious grief, what we may call mourning, as we mourn our loss. And that's what ritualizing is about, is making the choice to honor that which we lost and that which is unresolved. Whether that be those quote unquote non-death losses, or that could be grieving our growth, that could be uh, grieving for someone else. Um, that sort of grief um, needs almost a container or a way to hold in a ritual that will honor what is gone. Sometimes my ritual is this simple. We talk a lot about self-care, and self-care is so important. But a lot of times my self-care is I just let myself fall apart. I just, after a shift, I get in my car, turn the car on, complete silence, and I just weep for 5, 10 minutes. That's sometimes just my ritual. That's how I honor the day. Other times, I will name every patient, whether out loud or in my head, every patient that I saw, their families. I may do a prayer for them, but I name something that I may have learned from them. It is my way of honoring their memory. I transmute my grief into honoring memory. So you may find a different ritual, just like their birthdays, anniversaries, Sunday service, rite of passage. We mark these milestones. It's incredibly important that we try to find some kind of ritual, something simple that's not so much of a burden. In Korean culture, we have something called Chesa, which is Death Day. And so just like their birthdays, we do Death Day. And every year on Chesa, we honor our late matriarchs and patriarchs. We get out a timeline, we read their accomplishments, and then we each share a memory. We do this every year. We share a memory that we had with them. The last time we did Chesa for my father-in-law's father, I never got to meet my grandfather-in-law. So hearing their stories in some way almost resurrects my father-in-law's father, almost like makes him alive again. And I don't have any memories with him, but I do get to ask questions. And the question that I asked last time at Chesa was our Chesa service. I asked my father-in-law, how did your father laugh? And suddenly my father-in-law is a pretty chill guy, cool-headed, even tone, but he just suddenly burst into this laughter. Um, and everyone at the table who knew my father-in-law's dad, they started laughing because my father-in-law nailed it. It was perfect. And in that way, we were able to remember and commemorate him, to lift up his memory. And in some small way, he became alive again, and I could almost hear him and see him. And we didn't shy away from that loss. In fact, that loss was able to make us bigger. That loss was able to expand us and enlarge us. We didn't let go, we let in. We didn't move on, we moved with. And so, in every culture in the world, there is what Caitlin Doughty calls death engagement. There is a very intense and meaningful and engaged way of processing death. Western culture is one of the few, in fact, that we, stuff the body with preserving agent, we bury 6 feet under, and then we jettison and segregate into a funeral. And that process sometimes feels very alien to me and can feel alien to many of us. That this is what we do with our dead. We sell all their belongings in a garage sale, that we try to move them over here into a separate lot. But if you look at cultures around the world, whether it's Chesa or Dia de los Muertos, or you look at the one tribe every summer, they exhume their matriarch or patriarch and have tea with them. You look at cultures where they keep their dead front and center. Um, that's a healthy way of incorporating and embracing the loss. It's taking the sorrow of that loss and saying, this is what I'm going to move forward with in a world without them. This is how I will honor that person, that one person, whoever lived, who was just that one person. Can't let them go. I will take them with me. Um, you know, I had a patient who she was a person of color, and her parents came. My patient had just lost her child. It was a FDIU, fetal demise in utero, and she was a person of color, and her parents um, were had a tradition where they could name their grandchild in their language, and so their child who died, uh, fetal demise in utero, of course, you know, lived only a few certain number of weeks. Um, the grandparents still wanted to name their grandchild. And so there was this beautiful beautiful naming ceremony for this grandchild, my patient's child, who would never make it into the world, whose dream, whose future was cut short. But this was their ritual, their way of honoring this future that can, couldn't come to pass. We call that intrapsychic grief, the grief of losing what will never be. It's grieving a future loss. Not exactly a loss, but a loss all the same. And this naming ceremony was just a beautiful way of saying our child, our grandchild, as short-lived as their life was a whole and real person. This is a whole and real loss, even just a few weeks old. So we will name them. This need for ritual is so important that when I attend FDIUs, when I attend in the NICU children who have died or children who are really struggling, I get called to do baptisms and blessings. And those can be excruciating. But what I found is about half the time, the parents tell me they're not religious, the mom or the dad, or both. And what they tell me is we just want anything to grasp onto, hope. We just want to know that our child is in heaven, or we just need this because we want to honor our child with something official, something formal. Just the visceral sight and act of being able to sprinkle water on this child, give them a name, give them up to God or something bigger than ourselves, to say that this child meant something to us, even if they only breathed for a little while. I've been to a lot of those, and I've had the honor and privilege of blessing many children, blessing many FDIUs. And for me, what an honor that is. And families who are not religious at all, who would never step foot in a church. This is the honor that I'm able to give them, even if it's just for a glimpse of hope, a glimpse of assurance, a glimpse of ritual. And it's a hard and beautiful thing that I get to be a part of. Um, so I ask, what are some rituals that we can create for ourselves within the capacity of being providers? What are some rituals that maybe we wish we had that we can start now that are helpful? Again, not something to be a burden, but something to be a release for you. Um, I'd like to read this from a book called My Grandmother's Hands by Resma Menakem. He writes about bodily movement, or what we may call interoception. He says many Black bodies, he's talking about the Black community, have proven very resilient, in part because over generations, African Americans have developed a variety of body-centered responses to help settle their bodies and blunt the effects of racialized trauma. These include individual and collective humming, rocking, rhythmic clapping, drumming, singing, grounding touch, wailing circles, and call and response. What are some other ways that we can ritualize? Maybe journaling, or maybe you can't stand journaling. It could be sitting silently with a friend. I remember during an intense time of grief, I would sometimes call a friend and I would say, I don't have the energy to talk or to listen, but if you can just stay on the phone with me while I do my laundry, and once in a while, I'd just like to hear you breathe, that's what I need right now. Not somebody that I need to talk with, but somebody just to be there over the phone. And they stay with me over the phone for a good 15 minutes. And they would do this once in a while when I really just needed somebody to be there. What are some other ways that we can honor the losses that we have? I'm thinking of families where the average American workplace, if you lose a loved one, you get 4 days of leave. That's the average amount of time that you get. 4 days of leave is not enough for the death of a spouse, child, parent. 4 days, that's the average. I was at a workplace where the work manual said you get 2 days. So if we get 4 days, how do we as providers, how do we as friends and family create relief between the gears of a busy and demanding world? How can we create relief for our patients, for ourselves, for our family and friends in a world that's going to demand so much from them? How do we create relief within grief when a world is going to try to get them right back into the cycle of productivity? How can we be those who unburden those who are so hurt and wounded by the loss that they're experiencing? I think of it all the time about we're in the gears of a very busy world, a system that is not always friendly to those of us grieving. But how do we create relief between those gears for those who are grieving? And so that can be a type of ritual, a commemoration. It could be bringing hamburgers or ice cream. It could be taking a friend out, or it could just be sitting over the phone with them. These are things that I'm constantly thinking of for my patients because every patient is different. There are adult coloring books that we've given, model airplanes. There are times when it's just sitting with them when they watch an episode of a TV show. It could be prayer, it could be singing, it could be dancing, but I'm always thinking of what can we do to commemorate and honor, not to turn away from, but to turn towards. And just as all of us grieve differently, all of us need differently. I'll say that again. Just as all of us grieve differently, we need differently. So what can we do for our grief in all the different ways that we need? Um, at this time, I would love to open up for Q&A. Um, I have the app open here where I believe I'll see the questions. So if you have questions, I would love to answer them for you. If there's anything in the session at all that needed clarification or wasn't clear, also would love to answer that as well. Um, Here's a question that has been, I believe, pinned to the top, and it says, how to help parents cope with trying to have another child. This is a really tough one, for sure. My wife and I, our first child, it took about 10 months. And then our second child, unfortunately, we suffered a miscarriage. And then our third child, our rainbow baby, we were lucky in that my wife got pregnant again rather quickly. Um, but for anyone trying, whether it's 10 months, 5 years, um, it can feel like a long time. Any amount of time can feel very long. Trying is very, very difficult. Um, so what I may say to that is probably going to be easy and obvious advice, but I would say to lean on your supports for sure and to know that you're definitely absolutely 100% not alone in that. You know, when I've visited now patients who are suffering miscarriages, sometimes a thing that I'll say is, I know that this is a terrible club to be a part of. And then I may self-disclose and say, my wife and I suffered this last Easter of 2023. And what a awful and terrible feeling that it is. So those of us who are trying to have another child and it feels like it's taking forever, those of us who have suffered miscarriage, those of us who have trauma with giving birth, we're not alone in that. Leaning on our supports, recognizing that it's hard for all of us. Every part of it is difficult, and it's just to lean on one another in the difficulty of it. Another pin question. What suggestions do you have to help parents of multiples who lost one of the babies and the other still in the NICU? I often hear them say or observe that they do not give themselves the time to grieve their loss as they feel the need to focus on the baby in the NICU. Yes, so I've unfortunately and sadly have seen this situation multiple times about the baby, the having one child lost and then another child who survived. So for one, how resilient and fragile are we that a mother could have twins, one survives, one doesn't? That to me is always, that's a whole other thing on its own, just to even consider that, the enormity of that. Um, but what I've often seen, and this goes back earlier to only getting the 4 days of bereavement time from our workplace, we are demanded so much, especially new mothers, new parents. We are asked to be so much, to do so much. And so, as care providers, we want to try to bring as much relief as possible as we can. Um, and so, I often ask, how can I support those who are dealing with that in a way where they're getting so many different demands? Is there paperwork? Is there a way that I can schedule feedings? Is there a way that I can bring extra resources for them? Is there a way that I can follow up with them at home? What are the physical burdens that I can help to relieve? Because a lot of that is going to give them the space to be able to grieve. One of the reasons why we don't have a lot of time and permission to grieve is because we do live in a constantly producing world that expects us to be back to 100% in our mental health and our productivity, no matter the losses or difficulty that we face. And so, knowing that, how do we take away or relieve some of those burdens so that that person has a little bit of cushion room to grieve? It's never going to be the percentage that we want. It will never be they suddenly now get to have all the time that they need. But between the gears, I think we can find a way to make as much cushioning space as possible. Is there a way that we can get them a massage? Because holding a child is very difficult. How do we set them up with a therapist, with psych? How do we set them up with the right medications? How do we set them up to be able to thrive? Are there even ways that we can help them to have joy and to have fun in this moment? Because of the very intense grief in the baby, it's right in their face here, but is there something that they enjoy doing in their own lives? And I say that to parents too, trying to find that time for ourselves. It's very, very difficult. So I know that I wish I could answer that question even better than I have. I don't think that's a complete answer that I gave. Um, but I think a small thing to consider is being able to relieve the burden in order for that person to have space to grieve is incredibly important. And again, leaning on support. Um, Next question. Can you speak some to the relief that comes sometimes when we experience a loss? Because there's also an ending to the stress or pain of the situation and the guilt that can be felt around that relief. How do we help make space for that part of grief and loss? So that specific type of grief, when we feel relief because the source of stress is gone, that's often called disenfranchised grief. It's a grief that's not often recognized or even not even socially approved or validated. So, for example, if you have the loss of a person in your life who was abusive, or the loss of a spouse who cheated and overspent and who was sort of a tyrannical shadow in the home, you can also grieve the death of an ex-spouse. A lot of complicated feelings there. You can have complicated feelings about a boss or a manager who got fired or who left. That sort of grief, there's going to be extreme feelings of guilt because you may feel good that this source of stress is gone. I have been at deathbeds where adult children felt many layers of feelings because the adult children are grieving the death of their parent who was abusive. And as they're grieving this person, their grieving is very complicated, disenfranchised, because they're grieving the image of the person that they needed in their lives and didn't have. And they're also angry in their grief. How could you have done this to me? And also angry that we didn't get more time to be able to try to make this right. So that's a very complicated grief, maybe too much for the Q&A, but I can say this. I can say that about disenfranchised grief, those feelings are natural to have. The feelings of guilt, of anger, of even relief. That abuser is gone, that source of stress is gone. And there's going to be equal parts of maybe sorrow and a little bit of celebration. And there's going to be a lot of conflict there. And so we can take those one at a time and acknowledge that those are real, natural, normal feelings to have, that it's okay to feel both the guilt and the relief and the guilt over the relief. So anyone who's interested in learning about that, disenfranchised grief, even ambiguous loss can cover that a little bit. It's a grief that's not as talked about, but it is something that happens that can become very, very layered, complex, and something that we do need to acknowledge. Um, how can you best help families experiencing anticipatory grief, parents whose babies are in palliative or hospice care? Um, so anticipatory grief comes with a lot of anxiety about the loss that will happen. I've seen this with adult children dealing with parents who have dementia or or Alzheimer's, who see their parents declining in their autonomy and their capacity. And we see this with babies in, as the question says, in palliative care. And so I think there are at least a couple things we can do. Um, One is we do a lot of memory making in our hospital. I'm sure you're familiar with that as well, where we may do handprints, locks of hair, where we try to record heartbeat or conversations, telemetry strips and glass bottles. We do bracelets. We do clay handprints as well. So sometimes memory making helps a little bit to fill the gap of I want to keep keepsakes of this person to honor their memory. And it gives me something visceral and tangible that I'm able to do. And to use that time that's still there to treasure and to cherish, to hold that time precious. So even families who are mourning a future loss of a parent who is declining or a baby in palliative care, if it means even to sit down and open up a book and to read to them or to share memories of them or plans or goals or hopes. Now, we don't know how much sometimes a patient who is declining can hear, big question in healthcare. And also reading to a baby, do we know how much they're comprehending? Not a lot. And at the same time, it's the sound of your voice, it's knowing that you're present, and maybe they can hear. It's that time that's spent that's going to be very valuable. And though, of course, that's never a situation that we asked for or wanted, it's still a way that we're able to make meaningful the time that we still have left as we anticipate the loss that is coming. So, how can we make memories in a physical and tangible way? And how do we spend the time that is left that we can make it precious and meaningful to make those milestone moments? Um, Next question. And thank you so much for these questions. These are incredibly difficult questions. Uh, these are hard to answer. I know that I'm not answering as complete as I would like to. I wish I could answer better, but I'm going to go ahead and keep trying my best to give short, quick answers for you. This next one, we have had 4 deaths in the past 4 days at our NICU. How do you help bedside staff when the air feels heavy? Um, okay, I do want to pause first and just honor and lift up um, these 4 precious lives that were lost. Um, I remember every one of my patients. It's a hard thing about having a good memory, a decent memory. And I just want to remember and honor and lift up these 4 who are no longer with us. Um, if you have seen 4 um, precious children who have died, what a hard thing that is. How do you help bedside staff when the air feels heavy? In the hospital where I work, we do something called a code lavender, where the chaplains lead code lavenders. It can be done in many ways. Sometimes we bring a mobile snack cart with hot tea and coffee, bananas, chips, chocolate. And then we bring stuff to do rituals with. We have paper strips that dissolve in water. People can write the names of the deceased or their own prayers, put it in the water if they want to. Or we have something called a wailing jar where they can put those prayers and frustrations in the jar. We have marbles that we can put in water to commemorate the patient that we just lost, this precious life that is now gone. People, if they feel the need for self-care to take care of themselves, they can take as many chocolates as they want, bananas, healthy snacks that we bring. We have fabric that we can tear. We rend the fabric as this visceral way of showing our anger and our grief. That's how we feel, rending this fabric. I feel torn, but also just that physical act of doing that, of releasing and manifesting our anger in the world. Sometimes we brought pottery, and some people can use hammers, or we put a fabric over the pot, and people can smash the pots out of frustration and their grief. Um, in Code Lavenders, we also do anointing or blessing of the hands, where I've had anointing oil, and I wear gloves doing this, but I anoint nurses or physicians' hands. I ask them how. How has everything been lately for you? And whatever they tell me, I then ask their permission. I always ask for permission if they want me to pray for them and anoint their hands. And when I pray, I just try to incorporate everything that's said, everything that they told me, and offer them strength. And I thank every nurse, every physician for the work that they did and for all the hard things that they're holding and for the work that their hands have done. Um, Maybe there is a way in your hospital if you can do a code lavender just to take time out. Sometimes we do the mobile cart. Sometimes I will station myself in a room for 1 or 2 hours, and there'll be an announcement by the charge um, or someone there who will announce. A unit coordinator can say, "Chaplain is here for code lavender." In our hospital, it's so well integrated now that everybody knows what it means, and it's their choice. They can come to the room or not. Some people find use for a chaplain, some don't, and that's okay. And we do this code lavender now by request. So there's a form in our portal that they can fill out, or we take a phone call from charge or from a nurse that says, "Hey, we need a code lavender here. We just had a lot of deaths." But the reason we do those things is we are making space to grieve because so much of our work in healthcare and so much of our work just in working is constantly producing, hustle, grind, produce for the institution, get our numbers, our quota, all this stuff. I gotta answer all these consults and things like that. But can we take time to recognize that we are taking on a lot in our bodies and it's very hard? So this code lavender is a way of doing that, just making space. And every nurse that I've talked to, because sometimes nurses just come in and they just want to talk. They don't want any of these. They don't want the chocolates. They don't want the any of this stuff. And I'll talk with them maybe 10, 30 minutes. And they have a lot going on in their lives. It's not just their work, but stuff going on in their own personal life and then how they feel about the world. Sometimes we just need to process what's going on. So can we make space for that? And so I encourage you within your systems, doesn't need to be that formal, but just maybe room to be able to say, hey, let's have a commemorating ritual for the difficulty that we've seen this week. And one thing that I've noticed that they ask for a lot, and maybe this is due to superstition or people just really feel like this is cleansing for them, is if there is a room or a floor where nurses, physicians, PCTs, they feel like there's been a lot of death, they will ask a chaplain, can you do some kind of prayer ritual or hope ritual? And we will gladly bless the rooms. And that feels almost cleansing. So we honor those who have been there and then we open the doors to be able to receive those who need further care. So that can be extremely helpful as well. So I think ask your team about that to see if there's a way to do that, whether you have chaplains or not. From Stacy in chat, what differentiates grief from depression? So I have struggled with depression for lifelong. And I'm been in therapy now for 4 years consistently, and I also take medication for my depression as well. I can say that depression is often very physiologically based. I know that there are reasons that can happen from it socially. For example, if we've had a lot of trauma in our childhood, that can develop later in life into depression. Depression can also say a lot about our self-worth and our self-image. And depression often feels like a loss of significance and meaning, as if we are walking through a fog and living no longer has value. And so depression can come from circumstantial and internal narratives, circumstantial events or internal narratives, but it can also just happen. There are times when I just spiral into depression. It doesn't have to be any one event or narrative. But depression is like walking through a fog where everything has lost color and so, very often, that stems from trauma that turns into this physiological condition. Grief is our response to loss and is our natural and needed response to loss. So, certainly, grief and depression can overlap. They don't have to be two separate things, they can both occur at the same time. But depression is very often an entire whole body doesn't need a reason walking through a fog feeling sorrow, but also numbness, feeling loss of significance. Whereas grief is often that marked response to an event that has happened, to a loss that we're experiencing. I know that we're at the end of our time. Please feel free to reach out to me on social media. I often check my messages. I may not respond quickly, but I always try to respond to them. I would love to keep in touch with you. Please feel free to reach out to me anytime. And thank you so much for your time and for being here with me today. And Katrina, I hand it back to you. Nina?
Thank you so much, JS, for that amazing talk and for sharing so openly about your own experiences and the things that you have witnessed in your work. We really appreciate you being with us here today. Thank you, everybody.